federal military government will be exercised by a Supreme Military Council, and details of which will be announced later.
After the first military coup that installed Major General Johnson Thomas Aguiyi-Ironsi as Nigeria's first military head of state on January 16, 1966, the northern soldiers had started planning by May 1966 the revenge of their leaders who had been murdered in January. The northerners were the major casualties of that coup that was carried out by soldiers mainly from the east. To them, it was an eastern-favored coup, as Aguiyi-Ironsi's regime was believed to be extremely partisan. This highlighted the feeling of insecurity of other groups. It created more problems than it solved old ones, which led to severe criticism of the supreme leader. The general himself may not have been necessarily nepotistic. Rather, he failed to see the sectional and clannish implications of events, policies, and appointments that were made during his tenure of office. 194 days after taking office, Aguiyi-Ironsi was murdered in a northern counter-coup on July 29, 1966, and for 3 days, the nation had no leader until Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon succeeded the late head of state on August 1, 1966. The immediate significance of the July coup was that it forced a return of an ethnic balance within the army, as neither the major ethnic groups, Hausa or Yoruba, was placed in power, but a minor ethnic group from the northern region in present-day Plateau State. In the confusion that followed the second coup d'etat, the slender confidence that remained between the Igbo and the northerners was shattered. Disturbances broke out in the east, but even more so in the north after August 1, 1966. The mass killings of the Igbos in the north was a deplorable act which was condemned by Nigerians, including the military governors. With the counter-coup of July 29, 1966, the political development of Nigeria's federal structure took a different turn. It was accentuated even more by the fact that the Eastern Region government in Enugu immediately threatened secession if certain grievances and demands were not met. The immediate concern of the federal government, therefore, was for it to find ways to appease the East, so long as such secession were within the framework of one Nigeria. Claiming he was not safe outside the East, the Eastern Military Governor, Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, refused to leave the region for any meeting anywhere in Nigeria. In a rejoinder, the federal government too argued that the Nigerian leader Yakubu Gowon could also not go to the east for a meeting. His life, they also claimed, was not safe there either. Tension mounted, and Lieutenant General Joseph Arthur Ankara of Ghana offered a neutral meeting place. The venue was Aburi, Ghana. The Aburi meeting started on January 4, 1967 and lasted for 2 days. Those who attended the meeting included Head of State Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon and military governors of the 4 regions, Hassan Usman Katsina of the Northern Region, Robert Adenka Adebayo, David Akbode Ejo, and Chukwuemeka Ojukwu of the West, Midwest, and Eastern Region respectively. Others included the military administrator of Lagos, Mobolaji Johnson, and the head of the Nigerian Army, Commodore Joseph Idet Akinwale, and the Inspector General of Police, Alhaji Kam Salem, among others. Aburi was significant for several reasons. First, that the leaders met at all was an achievement in itself. But even more tangible was the fact that the leaders agreed that force would not be used to settle the brothers' palaver. There was also the question of the disposition of Nigerian troops and the reorganization of the army after the second coup on July 29, 1966, and the subsequent killings that followed in May and September. Further, Ojukwu said that his region was perturbed, that contrary to Gowon's promise on August 9, 1966, that all soldiers would return to their region of origin, northern troops still occupied the western region. Gowon replied that his promise on August 9 applied to the repatriation of soldiers of northern origin stationed in the east back to the north and those of eastern origin stationed in the north back to the east. He had fulfilled his promise, he said. He then emphasized that soldiers of northern origin would remain in the west since there were only a few Yoruba in the Nigerian army. Ojukwu was not satisfied and further insisted on a reorganization of the army on a regional basis. Gowon was also firmly opposed to splitting up the army. Ojukwu claimed that Nigeria did not have a central government since the country, as a result of the second coup and its aftermath, resolved itself into three separate sovereign areas: the Lagos West-North area, the Midwest area, and the East area. But Gowon insisted that Nigeria was still one nation, an entity composed of 4 regions and a central government in Lagos. Ojukwu then proposed that the situation in the nation necessitated a drawing apart of the regions, because the separation of forces, the separation of the population, is in all sincerity necessary in order to avoid further friction and further killings. The other leaders, who also wanted one Nigeria, agreed to Ojukwu's proposal, but apparently without understanding the implication. This was the bombshell of Aburi. By agreeing to Ojukwu's argument that the regions should be first pulled apart in order to stay together, the other leaders in effect sanctioned Biafra's secession, hence the end of Nigeria as a single nation. They attended and left the Aburi meeting with a firm belief that Nigeria should and would continue as one nation. But they had gone to that meeting, as it seems, without adequate preparations in terms of a crew of legal and political advisors, which such a meeting demanded. They had gone to Aburi in a spirit of comradeship. Ojukwu, on the other hand, meant business. He arrived at Aburi with a strong team of legal, political, and economic advisors, secretaries, and realm of paper. Not only did the other leaders agree with Ojukwu that the regions and people of the nation first draw apart, they also agreed to the latter's suggestion that there be no supreme commander of the army, hence no head of government or head of state. What Ojukwu wanted was that whosoever is at the top should be a constitutional chap, a titular head, but he would only act where, say, we have all met and taken a unanimous decision. Since the unanimous decision of all regions was required before he could act in all matters which affected any of the regions or the nations as a whole, the commander-in-chief and head of government was so only in name. He would still be a titular head. The point of the agreement at Aburi was that each region would be responsible for its own affairs and that the federal military government would be responsible for matters that affected the entire country. A simple enough concept. Afterwards, the officers toasted their reconciliation and agreement with champagne. The federal government's jubilation was such that on his flight home, Ojukwu asked one of his secretaries whether the federal delegation had fully understood the implication of what had been agreed. However, no one at Aburi other than Ojukwu really understood the constitutional implication of what had been agreed. Ojukwu was obviously delighted with this, hence why he was in such a hurry to implement the decision taken, and why the federal government had to renege on them. Federal permanent secretaries who headed the various ministries of the government as of then as well as political and legal experts in the country, were appalled at the content of the Aburi Agreement when their leaders returned home. The permanent secretaries met on January 20, 1967 to evaluate the agreement, and they rightly argued that the title of Commander-in-Chief was a subtle way of either abolishing the post of the Supreme Commander or declaring it vacant now that its previous occupant, Major General Aguiyi Ironsi, was dead. They further reported that the proposal that all appointments to top posts in the military, civil service, and the diplomatic corps would be unanimously approved by the Supreme Military Council would tend to paralyze the functions of the Federal Public Service Commission. They also noted that the alliance and loyalty of the regional appointed officers of the federal government would be to regions, meaning in effect that there will be no federal public service. The summary of their report was that the Aburi Agreement summed up to a confederation. The leaders themselves were shocked. The shocking revelation of the meeting of the Aburi Agreement overshadowed some of the important decisions the leaders agreed to at Aburi in their search for peace and for a new basis of a stable federal union, or at least a national unity. Aburi on the whole was a big success, but interpretation of what transpired at the meeting devalued the success. Ironically, to implement the decisions agreed on at Aburi was necessary. Ojukwu set March 13, 1967 as a deadline for unilateral implementation of Aburi. Gowon, on the other hand, restated that the constitutional changes the East proposed would not work because such changes would result in the end of Nigeria as a single nation. Gowon had given too much away in Aburi that would have led to the destruction of the country. He legalized total regionalism, which would make the center very weak, and a weak center would eventually lead to confederation and total disintegration of the country. While the federal permanent secretaries were evaluating the document to which their leaders were signatories, Ojukwu and the East had grown tougher with their demands. On their own, the other military leaders on March 17, 1967, issued a significant policy, Decree No. 8, which conferred far more powers on regional governments than before. This was deliberately done in the hope that a new and greater degree of decentralization would placate the East so that it would not succeed and a potentially consequent brutal war would be avoided. This Decree No. 8 ignored the report of the permanent secretaries but did not fully concur with Ojukwu's demands. It also decentralized the government to such an extent that the regions were virtually autonomous units, in each of which each regional governor had executive powers. However, Ojukwu would reject the decree because a part of the decree stated that no region shall exercise its executive authority so as to impede or prejudice the exercise of the executive authority of the Federation or to endanger the continuance of federal government in Nigeria. Further, it provided that the Supreme Military Council can also take appropriate measures against a region which attempt to secede from the rest of the Federation and could take over the functions of that region. The part Ojukwu and his Easterners hated the most stated that the federal government could declare a state of emergency in any region which violated any of the above provisions on the consent of the remaining 3 regions instead of the unanimous decision of all the 4 regions. As a result, Ojukwu set March 31, 1967 as the due day for the unilateral implementation of the Aburi Agreement, but the East did not succeed. Instead, it seized all federal revenue which came from that part of the country. In the meantime, the Yoruba people were dissatisfied with the presence of troops of northern origin who occupied the western region, and the decision to recruit Yoruba people into the army did little to ease those feelings. So, the Yoruba through Chief Obafemi Awolowo proposed that should the East succeed, the West would feel free to follow suit. The federal government was caught pants down, while Ojukwu and his cohort in the East popped champagne. While the federal government was still trying to steady itself from these revelations, the northern leaders made an astonishing suggestion: the creation of more states. The nation was stunned. The question of the creation of more states, particularly in the north, had been a perennial issue which northern politicians had always resisted, and southerners had accused the north of trying to dominate Nigeria forever. They also believed that the Nigerian crisis would be over if the north accepts that power can be shared. Breaking up the north into more states, which was what the East and other parts of the nation wanted, would provide the answer. The northern decision was a pleasant surprise to most of the nation, particularly the minority people of the north, that is the Middle Belt areas, and those of the Cross River or Goja River area, which the secessionists would later claim as part of their government. Because of this, Ojukwu did not agree to the Northern Declaration for the creation of more states. The Westerners, who had been one of the ardent advocates of the creation of more states, felt pleased with the unprecedented Northern move, and they eventually threw their support behind the federal government. Now energized, the federal government was ready for a showdown with authorities in the East, as the authorities in the Eastern region executed some acts which provoked the federal government. These acts included seizure of over £200,000 worth of produce belonging to the Northern Region Marketing Board that was in Port Harcourt in the East awaiting shipment, the confiscation of 1/3 of the entire rolling stock of the Nigerian Railway, as well as 115 oil tankers. Other acts include the seizure, also at Port Harcourt, of a Nigerian Airway DC-3 aircraft which had left Ikeja Airport earlier on the same day on April 5, 1967. A week later, 3 Igbo gunmen in civilian clothing hijacked another plane belonging to the Nigerian Airways, which was flying from Benin in the Midwest region to Lagos. The federal government immediately halted all further flights to the eastern region. Terrorist activities in Lagos and other parts of the country heightened tension. Before long, the economic sanctions against the East were beginning to bite as a result of an economic blockade of the East in the early May 1967. A few days later, on May 26, 1967, Ojukwu addressed the East's Consultative Assembly consisting of some 300 delegates from all provinces in the East. He declared, and I quote, "There is no power in this country or in all Black Africa that would be able to subdue us by force." It was left to the assembly, Ojukwu continued, to choose one of these 3 alternatives, accepting the terms of the North and go on, and thereby submitting to the domination from the North, or continuing the present stalemate and drift, or ensuring the survival of our people by asserting our autonomy. The assembly got the message. For whatever it was worth, it gave Ojukwu the powers and urged him to declare at an early practicable date for eastern Nigeria as a free, sovereign and independent state by the name and title of the Republic of Biafra. The authorities in Lagos had anticipated the move and had prepared for it. On May 27, 1967, Gowon declared a state of emergency for the entire nation and announced that he had assumed full powers for the short period necessary to carry out the measures which are now urgently required. Decree number 8, which was promulgated deliberately to appease the East, was nullified. Gowon also announced that Nigeria was divided into more states, 12 in all. Nigerians were jubilant as the minorities felt secure and out of domination by the majority peoples within the former regions. The northern region was broken into 6 states: Northwestern, North Central, Northeastern, Benue Plateau, Kano, and Kwara, thereby cracking its monolithic posture. The East was broken into 3, the Igbo people having their own state East Central, and the non-Igbo minority people in the East 2 of their own states Rivers and Cross River. The Midwest remained as it was. Some part of the western region was carved out and merged with the Federal Territory of Lagos to form Lagos State. What remained of the western region became the Western States. The creation of more states in the country pushed the East Central State, the Igbo heartland, into an interior pocket, cut off from the coastal oil reserves and its two seaports of Port Harcourt and Calabar. Thus, the lack of seaport for the East Central State was not unique. For the secessionists, the creation of more states was a bombshell, a political reality which they refused to accept or even believe. They began to speed up the withdrawal of the eastern region, which would include, according to them, the two new states of Rivers and Cross River. On May 30, 1967, Ojukwu proclaimed that, quote, the territory and region known as Eastern Nigeria, together with her continental shelves and territorial water, shall henceforth be an independent sovereign state of the name and title, the Republic of Biafra. The new flag was hoisted in public buildings in the east, and the police and army appeared in different uniforms. A national anthem which sounded like Sibelu's Finlandia, and which Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe later claimed was plagiarized from his poem Ode to Onitsha, was broadcast. While nothing particularly dramatic happened for the next 30 days, the atmosphere was tense. Though the federal government had her own share of the blames, especially its tardiness after Aburi, she did everything possible to prevent the Nigerian balloon from bursting and to appease the East, to the extent that many Nigerians were doubting whether the federal government was a sick dog that could neither bark nor bite. Nigeria's political instability had now been pushed to its limits. On July 6, 1967, the federal government mounted what she initially termed a police action to arrest the secession. Subsequent events soon showed that it was not a mere police action. It was much more serious than that, particularly with the rebel capture of the Midwest region with another Igbo-engineered plot in the small Bene garrison on August 9, 1967. The assault on the Midwest had been a miscalculation, which led to the Midwest boomerang when the federal military government mounted a counter-offensive with Lieutenant Colonel Murtala Mohammed at the forefront. The succession was now such that it could not be stopped by just a police action, and the result was a 30-month cruel civil war in which over 1 million innocent civilian lives were lost, equipment worth billions of dollars wasted, and thousands of stalwart soldiers on both sides dead. In the end, Biafra surrendered unconditionally, pledged their allegiance to Nigeria, and the civil war officially ended on January 15, 1970.
And I would like, therefore, to take this opportunity to say that I, Major General Philip Effiong, officer administering the government of the Republic of Biafra, now wish to make the following declaration: that we affirm we are loyal Nigerian citizens and accept the authority of the Federal Military Government of Nigeria, that we accept the existing administrative and political structure of the Federation of Nigeria, that any future constitutional arrangement will be worked out by representatives of the people of Nigeria, that the Republic of Biafra hereby ceases to exist.
With the second highest death toll of all African conflicts, the Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Biafran War, is perhaps the single most significant event in Nigerian history. This 3-year conflict which raged on from the 6th of July 1967 till the 15th of January 1970, would claim the lives of over 100,000 soldiers and an estimated 2 million civilians as the Nigerian government, led by General Yakubu Gowon, fought to prevent the secession of the self-proclaimed Republic of Biafra, which was led by General Ojukwu Ojukwu. To fully understand the root cause of this brutal conflict, we need to go all the way back to the very beginning. Upon gaining independence from Great Britain in 1960, the newly formed Nigerian Republic was greatly divided as its three largest ethnic groups struggled to live in harmony. Beyond the more obvious distinctions like language, clothing, and marriage customs, Nigeria's three main ethnic groups also had fundamental differences in values and worldviews, which had been developed over the many centuries leading up to the colonial era and the formation of the Nigerian state. The Igbos, who represented about 60 to 70% of the population of the southeast, were mostly Christians who in the centuries before the colonial era had lived in relatively egalitarian societies. Although most Igbo towns and villages were headed by monarchs known as Izes, the political decision-making process within Igbo communities was actually quite democratic, as it involved general assemblies composed of title holders and other respected members of Igbo society. Status was acquired through one's ability to solve societal issues, and respect was given primarily to those who had acquired wealth, as opposed to those who had simply inherited it. The character of Okonkwo in the book Things Fall Apart by renowned Nigerian author Chinua Achebe was in many ways the perfect illustration of the uniquely Igbo vision of the self-made man. The Igbo's particular appreciation for wealth creation through hard work is undoubtedly the main reason why many of Nigeria's champions of industry have been of Igbo ancestry. By contrast, the majority Muslim Hausa Fulani, which represented about 65% of the northern population, had lived for many years in feudal societies in which large working-class populations were ruled by a small theocratic elite composed of emirs and sultans. As their political leaders often doubled as religious leaders, compliance and submission to the will of the political establishment was not simply a civic duty, but a religious one. Very much unlike in Igbo societies, there was nothing particularly odd or shameful about a man aspiring to live a modest life as a farm worker, craftsman, or a nomadic cattle herder. But contrary to commonly held prejudices, the Hausa Fulani were not in any way lazier or inherently less enterprising than their southern counterparts. They simply had a deeper appreciation for religious discipline and had a more socially conservative worldview. However, there is no denying the fact that while the unquestioning submissiveness of northern societies to the theocratic establishment guaranteed internal stability and order, it also meant that the North was a lot less economically vibrant. Northerners were generally less open to new ideas and often completely rejected secular education in favor of Islamic education. Demonstrating the extent of Nigeria's North-South divide, some studies estimated that as at Nigeria's independence in 1960, northern Nigeria had an English literacy rate of just 2%, compared to the Southeast, which had an English literacy rate of 19.2%. The Yorubas, which formed about 75% of Nigeria's southwestern population, were in many ways a sort of halfway house between the Igbos and the Hausa Fulani, both in terms of their religious affiliation and their political history. Although also majority Christian, they nevertheless had significant populations of Muslims as well as followers of the ancient Yoruba religions. In simple terms, the traditional Yoruba political structure was basically less autocratic than the Hausa Fulani, but not as democratic as the Igbo. For centuries, Yoruba societies were ruled by kings known as Obas, who governed in close consultation with chiefs, priests, and priestesses. Culturally, the Yorubas were quite similar to the Igbo in their appreciation for individual drive and ambition. However, the Yorubas tended to channel their energies towards excellence in the arts and academia, as opposed to pure industry and wealth creation. Many often point to the Yorubas' deep appreciation of the arts as the reason why many of Nigeria's most prominent cultural icons, such as Afrobeat legend Fela Kuti and the Nobel Prize laureate Professor Wole Soyinka, have been of Yoruba ancestry. But to say that the differences between Nigeria's three main tribes meant that every Igbo, Yoruba, or Hausa Fulani person hated anyone who wasn't from their tribe would be very far from the truth. In reality, most Yoruba societies got on well enough with Igbo societies. The main culture clash, if you like, was between the Hausa Fulanis of the north and the two major ethnic groups of the south. Prior to the colonial era, ancient Yoruba kingdoms such as the Oyo Empire had for many years suffered under several waves of jihadi attacks by the Islamic Sokoto Caliphate of the North, led by the famous Sultan Uthman Dan Fodio. Now, although the Igbos did not have a similar history of warring with the Hausa Fulani, the British colonial enterprise would create the perfect environment for the sharp differences between these two tribes to be brought to the forefront. In 1914, British High Commissioner Frederick Lugard effectively created the country we know today as Nigeria by bringing the northern and southern regions together in the now infamous Nigerian Amalgamation of 1914. Till this very day, the feeling amongst many Yoruba and Igbo historians is that one of the main purposes of this amalgamation was to place the more affluent South under the control of the autocratic North. The theory goes that by joining the more educated and therefore less controllable southern region to the much larger northern region, the British government was better able to implement its policy of indirect rule, as the amalgamation essentially gave dominion over the entire country to the northern elites, who were significantly less rebellious and generally more amenable to British interests. It is also worth noting that from 1914 onwards, the British adopted a practice of placing Northerners in key leadership positions within the colonial administration. Despite being generally better educated, Southerners were more often than not limited to managerial and executive roles within the colonial apparatus. When the struggle for Nigeria's independence began to take shape, it was mainly Yoruba and Igbo intellectuals such as the political activist Fumi Ransom Kuti and the renowned jurist Jaja Ojukwu that led the fight for Nigeria's sovereignty. According to some historians, many of the northern elites were not at all welcoming to the idea of an independent Nigeria, as they feared that independence would mean losing the privileged positions that they had enjoyed under the colonial structure. The story goes that as a condition for them agreeing to support the push for Nigeria's independence, the northern leadership specifically demanded that the new nation maintain its colonial political structure. And even though it pretty much guaranteed a continuation of the North's dominance, the Igbo and Yoruba leaders, in their desperation to gain independence at all costs, agreed to the North's demands. And so upon its independence on the 1st of October 1960, the Nigerian state was divided into 3 geopolitical regions, in which a disproportionately large northern region was united with 2 smaller eastern and western regions. Nigeria's British-style parliamentary government was led by its first and only Prime Minister, Alhaji Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, the northern co-founder of his political party, the Northern People's Congress. Tafawa Balewa's NPC party governed in coalition with the Igbo-aligned National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, which was led by Nigeria's Governor-General, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, the man who would later go on to serve as the ceremonial president of the First Nigerian Republic, which was established in 1963. The Yoruba-aligned Action Group Party, which was headed by Chief Obafemi Awolowo, played the opposition role. If unity was the goal, then the Nigerian state had gotten off to a very bad start. Nigeria's parliamentary system was a bit of a farce, as Nigeria's 3 main parties were not built around ideology, but on ethnic nationalism. With the vast majority of Nigeria's general population still largely unfamiliar with the Western-style democratic system of their new country, pretty much everyone voted based on ethnicity. The Southwesterners voted for the AG, the Southeasterners for the NCNC, and the Northerners for the NPC. And as the northern region was by far the largest constituency, the NPC was basically guaranteed control over Nigeria, as none of the other 2 parties could compete with the NPC's large northern voting base. As you can imagine, it was only a matter of time before the shoddy foundations on which the Nigerian state had been built began to show serious signs of strain. The entrepreneurial spirit of the Igbos would see many of them move out of their hometowns in search of all the opportunities their new nation had to offer. From Lagos to Benin, Port Harcourt, and even major northern cities like Kano and Kaduna, Igbos began to build businesses and pioneer new industries in the places they migrated to. But as is often the case with successful immigrants, it wasn't long before many of the locals, especially in the north, began to feel more than a bit uncomfortable with the success of their new neighbors.
One thing I've noticed, Premier, while I've been here, is that Northerners seem to have, I might almost call it, obsession about the Igbos. Could you perhaps explain that to me?
Well, the Igbos are more or less the type of people whose desire is mainly to dominate everybody. If they go to a village, to a town, they want to monopolize everything in that area. If you put them in a labor camp as a laborer, within a year they will try to emerge as headman of that camp, and so on. Well, in the past, our people were not alive to their responsibilities, because you can see from our northernization policy that in 1952, when I came here, there weren't 10 northerners in our civil service here. Then I tried to have it northernized, and now all important posts are being held by northerners.
Is this policy of filling all key posts in the north solely with northerners and not with other Nigerians a temporary or a permanent one?
In actual fact, what it is a northerner first. If you can't get a northerner, then we take an expatriate like yourself on contract. If we can't, then we can employ another Nigerian, but on contract too. This is going to be permanent, I should say, as far as I can foresee, because it will be rather dangerous to see the number of boys who are now turning from all our learning institutions coming out with having no work to do. I'm sure whichever government of the day might be, it will feel rather embarrassed, and it might even lead to bloodshed.
Doesn't this damage the idea, sir, of all people in all regions in Nigeria being fellow citizens of one country?
Well, it might, but you are, new to our region, but how many northerners are employed in the east or in the west? The answer is no. And if there may be 10 laborers employed only in the two regions.
It was against this backdrop of rising anti-Igbo sentiment in the north that the chain of events that ultimately led to the Civil War would begin to unfold. By as early as the year 1966, most Nigerians had already begun to resent the ruling elite for their lavish lifestyles and lack of sensitivity to the concerns of the masses. Rumors about vote rigging, corruption, and backdoor deals between politicians and foreign companies began to spread, and there was a general sense of discontentment in the air. Deciding that enough was enough, Major Ojukwu Kaduna Nzeogu, an Igbo officer in the Nigerian army, instigated a revolutionary coup against the federal government. This coup would see the assassination of the Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa, the Premier of the Northern Region Sir Ahmadu Bello, as well as the Premier of the Western Region, Chief Samuel Akintola. But rather suspiciously, the President, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, would manage to escape the bloodbath as he was out of the country on holiday when the coup took place. But despite the execution of many key members of the government, the coup led by Major Nzeogu was ultimately unsuccessful, as it was quashed by a different faction of the Nigerian army, led by Major General Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi, who, interestingly enough, was also of Igbo ancestry. After managing to secure the surrender of the coup plotters, Aguiyi Ironsi was declared military head of state. But even though both the instigator and the stopper of the coup were of Igbo descent, various conspiracy theories began to spread in the north, suggesting that the entire thing was all part of an undercover master plan to put General Aguiyi Ironsi in power and transfer control of Nigeria over to the Igbos. Oddly enough, there was actually a fair bit of evidence in support of this theory. 4 out of 5 of the coup plotters were Igbo, and although Aguiyi Ironsi stopped the coup, he did not execute any of the coup plotters. To make matters worse, no significant Igbo leader was killed in the coup. President Nnamdi Azikiwe had avoided all the drama thanks to his suspiciously timed holiday, while Michael Okpara, the Premier of the Eastern Region, had also managed to survive the coup, even though he did end up losing his job to Colonel Chukwuemeka Ojukwu, the man who would later go on to lead Biafra's attempt to break away from Nigeria. These anti-Igbo conspiracy theories would eventually grow from mere rumor and conjecture to an article of faith in the minds of many Northerners. And on the 29th of July 1966, a group of Northern Army officers instigated a counter-coup against the Ironsi administration. Unlike the previous one, this coup was successful. Major General Aguiyi Ironsi was assassinated, and Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, a northerner, was installed as Nigeria's new military head of state. Unfortunately, the northern retaliation would not end there. In the 3 months following the coup, an estimated 8,000 to 30,000 Southeasterners living in the north would be attacked, killed, and robbed by local mobs. Fearing for their lives, over 1 million Southeasterners fled back to their homelands, leaving behind businesses, homes, churches, and in some unfortunate cases, children that had been the fruit of inter-ethnic marriages. With the deluge of refugees flooding back into the eastern region with shocking stories of betrayal and trauma, the Nigerian project was on the brink of collapse. As many Easterners no longer felt safe in other parts of Nigeria, the military governor of the eastern region, Colonel Ojukwu, began to call for Igbos from all around Nigeria to return home. Rumors about the eastern region's impending breakaway from Nigeria became front-page news after it was reported that a plane carrying imported weapons had crashed in the eastern city of Enugu. Knowingly or unknowingly, Colonel Ojukwu essentially confirmed all rumors with a series of rousing criticisms of the Gowon administration's failure to provide adequate protection to the thousands of Igbos who were being attacked and killed by people they imagined were their fellow citizens. With tensions at an all-time high, General Yakubu Gowon and other key members of the government agreed to meet with Colonel Ojukwu at a neutral location so that both sides could try to de-escalate the situation. This two-day meeting will take place in the Ghanaian town of Aburi from the 4th to the 5th of January 1967. To Gowon's great surprise, Colonel Ojukwu took the meeting very seriously and was very well prepared. He set out very clearly all of the eastern region's demands, which included greater political autonomy, greater control over the revenue from the southeast oil deposits, and also a restructuring of the Nigerian army in a way that devolved powers to the regions and got rid of the unfair recruitment quota system, which had allowed for a disproportionately large number of northerners to join the Nigerian army. Although many still debate what exactly was agreed at this meeting, General Ojukwu left Aburi fully convinced that Gowon had accepted all of the eastern region's demands. This controversial agreement, known today as the Aburi Accord, was not honored by the Gowon administration. Upon returning to Nigeria, General Yakubu Gowon decided instead to break Nigeria's regions into smaller states and turn Nigeria into an American-style federation composed of 12 states. Except unlike in the American system, each state had very little autonomy and very little control over its own resources. For many in the southeast, this was the last straw. With the Gowon administration having put its cards on the table, Colonel Ojukwu's mind was made up. He proceeded to consult with the various chiefs and traditional rulers of the eastern region, and on the 30th of May 1967, Ojukwu officially announced the secession of the eastern region and the establishment of the state of Biafra. And with the support of many key members of the southeastern leadership, Colonel Ojukwu cut all ties with the Nigerian army and was proclaimed General Ojukwu, Biafran President and Commander-in-Chief of the Biafran Army. The declaration of Biafra's secession was celebrated in the streets. For many, the establishment of Biafra was a long-awaited restoration of the pre-colonial sovereignty of the region and the beginning of a bright new dawn for its people. But unfortunately, the celebrations would be short-lived, as the Nigerian government's response was to declare war on Biafra. And although the Biafran army had no air force, no navy, and a chronic shortage of weapons and manpower, General Ojukwu was surprisingly optimistic about his new nation's ability to withstand the Nigerian army.
If civil war comes, and I do think it is imminent, you're quite right, it will for us be the price of freedom. Our people here have for a long time been prepared for this eventuality, and I am confident of their readiness. I think that when it does come, that the people on the other side would be surprised as to what they're going to get. And I'm confident that it will not last long. I can't say for certain what Lagos has got. When we lost direct contact with Lagos, they had some 4 battalions, ill-equipped, and I know that they have been purchasing a lot of arms since, and I know that they have negotiated and received a few armored vehicles. Prior to that, they had some scout cars. I know they have tried to get planes. I am not sure they have got them there. But on our side, we too have not been sitting quietly. There has been quite a lot of build-up. And I think what I have here is sufficient to maintain the integrity of Biafra and more.
But putting aside General Ojukwu's confident fighting talk, the reality of the matter was that Biafra was by far the underdog in this fight. The Nigerian military was larger, better funded, better trained, and had secured the support of Britain and other world powers. The expectation in Lagos was for the war to be over within a matter of weeks, or in the very worst case scenario, 6 months. But much to the surprise of the Nigerians, the Biafran army would prove a lot more resilient than they could have ever imagined. Despite being composed of a largely untrained and unskilled group of young men and teenage boys, the Biafrans would manage to withstand the Nigerian onslaught for 3 brutal years. The early campaigns of the Nigerian forces were quite successful, as they quickly managed to reclaim significant Biafran cities and monuments. But after nearly a year of fighting, the war reached a stalemate as the Biafran army began to stand its ground and maintain control of key cities and towns. Within the nation itself, the civilian population tried to carry on living life as normally as they could. With most of the men and boys on the battlefront, it was up to the women to manage the day-to-day running of the country. But as the war raged on, any hopes that the civilian population had of continuing to live their normal lives began to fade away. With both sides unable to reach an agreement, despite several attempts at peace talks, including one in Ethiopia presided over by Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, the Gowon administration came to the very reckless conclusion that the only way to break the deadlock would be to trigger its nuclear option. The Gowon-led forces mobilized to impose an economic blockade on Biafra, which blocked the flow of all food and ammunition supplies by land, air, and sea. This move would turn out to be perhaps the single most destructive political decision in West African history, as it would ultimately lead to the death by malnourishment of an estimated 2 million civilians most of whom were children suffering from the protein deficiency disease known as kwashiorkor. You see, prior to the war, dietary protein in the Biafran diet primarily consisted of locally sourced seafood, as well as dried stockfish, which was imported from Norway. Other sources of protein such as chicken, pork and beef were generally only enjoyed on special occasions, as they were often too expensive for the wider population. But as the blockade prevented the importation of Norwegian stockfish, and also restricted local fishermen's access to the seas, the region's protein supplies were quickly depleted, and the national diet was reduced to almost 100% starch. As the war took place around the golden era of TV media, the images of millions of malnourished Biafran children, projected on TV sets worldwide, would be one of the global community's earliest introductions to the now infamous trope of the starving African child. Although the Nigerian government strategy was indefensible, it is important to point out that the government's supposed reasoning at the time was that the blockade would be nothing more than a short, sharp shock, and that General Ojukwu, seeing the immense suffering of his people and the dwindling ammunition of his frontline soldiers, would have no other choice but to surrender. However, what the Nigerians had failed to realize was that the Biafran state had secured the support of a foreign benefactor of its own. Although the only countries to publicly recognize the state of Biafra were Tanzania, Gabon, the Ivory Coast, Zambia, and Haiti, Charles de Gaulle's France had taken a secret interest in Biafra, as it saw it as the perfect addition to its sphere of influence in West Africa. According to French President Charles de Gaulle, Biafra was a just and noble cause, and so working closely with the French-aligned governments of the Ivory Coast under President Félix Houphouët-Boigny and the Gabonese Republic, led by President Omar Bongo, the French government helped to prolong the war by providing Biafra with weapons, mercenary fighters, and as much food as could be smuggled past the Nigerian blockade. France also publicized Biafra's cause on the international stage, describing the situation as nothing short of a genocide. The eventual discovery of France's involvement in the war would lead to protests on the streets of Lagos, with many accusing the French government of being the real reason why the war had continued, despite the fact that the Biafran forces had very little chance of overcoming the Nigerian military. But did France really get involved in the war simply because Charles de Gaulle considered Biafra to be a just and noble cause? Well, not exactly. France's involvement was all about economics, and had very little to do with some romantic desire for the Biafran people to share in the French ideals of liberté, égalité, and fraternité. Later investigations will show how the French state-owned oil company ELF had secured lucrative drilling agreements with the Biafran state. Had Biafra successfully seceded from Nigeria, these agreements would have guaranteed ELF access to the equivalent of 7% of Nigeria's oil supply, and given the French government a nice slice of the Nigerian pie, which since the discovery of oil back in 1956, had been enjoyed solely by the Shell BP oil company. Although the French government tried to keep its ties to Biafra secret, General Ojukwu did very little to hide his country's French connection. From as early as the first year of the war, General Ojukwu had already begun to suggest that French would be made compulsory in Biafran secondary, technical, and teacher training schools. In his own words, he was very keen for his people to benefit from the rich culture of the French-speaking world. As the death toll began to rise exponentially, the whole world was becoming more aware of the level of carnage and immense suffering of the Biafran people. The Nigerian diaspora was galvanized, and protests and counter-protests began to take place on the streets of London and New York. Some Nigerians blamed General Ojukwu for the deaths of his own people, arguing that by continuing in a war that he knew fully well he could not win, he was putting his personal ambition ahead of the lives of millions of people. But for many in the Biafran diaspora, the economic blockade was nothing short of a vicious genocide aimed at exterminating the Igbo people once and for all. Another accusation that was thrown at General Ojukwu was that the only way he managed to cajole his army and his people to continue in the fight for Biafra was by reporting stories of false victories and by giving false guarantees about the imminent end of the war. On the Nigerian side, the government continued to double down on its position. Despite reports of horrific levels of death and suffering, the Gowon-led government refused to blink first and continued to accuse General Ojukwu of killing his own people by lying to them about their chances of winning the war.
I do not wish to say anything on this occasion that might be regarded as prejudicial to the peace talks now going on in Kampala, Uganda. But in the words of Mr. Asika, the rebel leaders ought to know when enough is enough. They should call a halt to the shameless deception of innocent Igbos with reports of fictitious victories on the battlefronts. They should appreciate that the so-called diplomatic recognition by dubious characters cannot, in the least, alter the course of Nigerian history. It is sheer wickedness for Ojukwu and his clique to continue to goad innocent citizens to support rebellion and lay down their lives for a cause that is not just. The rebel leaders know in their hearts of hearts that all their false propaganda about genocide and massacre derives from personal ambition and the haunting fear of their own future and safety. Consequently, they do not know when to stop. I call on those who claim to love Nigeria and the Igbos to face realities and advise the people of the East Central State to lay down their arms and return to the fold. It is not enough for organizations and individuals to ask the federal government to cease hostilities while ignoring the evil intentions of the rebels. I honestly believe it is in the true interest of the Igbos that they return to the fatherland. I am satisfied that all other Nigerians have learned the lesson of our most recent history and the current civil war. And I pray to God that there will never be a repetition.
You see, contrary to popular belief, the Biafran government was much more than just a rebel military force. General Ojukwu also assembled a group of elite writers and artists who were tasked with cultivating nationalist spirit at home and also spreading Biafra's message on the world stage. Political cartoons were put up all around the country, pushing simplistic interpretations of the causes of the war and demonizing not just the Nigerian military, but the Nigerian populace at large. On the international stage, notable members of the Biafran apparatus, such as Chinua Achebe and Gabriel Okara, publicized the plight of the Biafran people. They regularly denounced the actions of the Nigerian government and spoke about the atrocities they had witnessed in the country. The Biafran story became front-page news, and more members of the international community began to call on their own governments to take action. On the 29th of May 1969, Bruce Mayrock, an American student at Columbia University, set himself on fire at the United Nations headquarters in New York in protest of what he believed was a genocide against the nation and people of Biafra. He was pronounced dead the very next day. With more and more of their own citizens calling for political intervention, the response from Nigeria's international backers was to ramp up their military support for the Nigerian forces to help them break the Biafran resistance once and for all. With their increased firepower, the Nigerian Federal Forces launched another major attack on the Biafran defense in the last week of December 1969. This final offensive, known as Operation Tailwind, was executed by a battalion led by Colonel Olusegun Obasanjo, a man who would later go on to be a two-time president of Nigeria. Operation Tailwind would ultimately break the deadlock. After over 3 weeks of heavy fighting, the last two major strongholds of Owerri and Uli fell to the Nigerian forces. Unwilling to go down with the Biafran ship, General Ojukwu fled by plane to the Ivory Coast, leaving behind his deputy Philip F. Young to negotiate the terms of Biafra's surrender to General Yakubu Gowon on the 14th of January 1970.
The so-called rising sun of Biafra is set forever. It will be a great disservice for anyone to continue to use the word Biafra to refer to any part of the East Central state of Nigeria. The tragic chapter of violence is just ended. We are at the dawn of national reconciliation. Once again, we have an opportunity to build a new nation. You will have heard that my government may seek the assistance of friendly foreign governments and bodies, especially in the provision of equipment to supplement our national effort. There are, however, a number of foreign governments and organizations whose so-called assistance will not be welcome. These are the governments and organizations which sustained the rebellion. They are thus guilty of the blood of thousands who perished because of the prolongation of the futile resistance. They did not act out of love for humanity. Their purpose was to disintegrate Nigeria and Africa and impose their will on us.
To say that the Nigerian government did not do enough to bring healing and reconciliation in the years following the war would be a gross understatement. Even the federal troops that were deployed to assist in the resettlement of the survivors of the war would be accused of taking advantage of the people that were there to help.
I have complaints about the behavior of your troops. Many women say they've been molested and raped. Men say their property has been taken away from them, looted. Do you know anything about this?
I don't think that is true. To say general looting and raping and the rest of it, that couldn't be true. You know, in every war, there's always one or two odd soldiers who will behave in the out of the general pattern. And well, I won't deny that there will be cases of this. And you do realize that it's not very easy for officers to be there all the time to check this type of thing. But everything has been done to keep the soldiers out of the villages, out of the roads, out of the towns.
But here in the center of this town, Phil, I've personally seen soldiers taking household gear away from people's homes, loading it onto trucks and driving away. A sergeant major stopped one truck and made them take some stuff off.
That sometimes we carry refugees with their belongings from the towns to the villages.
Yeah.
This could be. But,
this was just property being taken out of a house, furniture, a bedstead, among other things.
Well, that might be one of the cases, the few odd cases I've talked about. But there are always people around who will check this type of thing, you know.
Have the federal troops behaved badly since they came here? Have they beaten people?
They're seizing of their things. Seizing of their properties.
They seize property?
Properties, and they're forcing some girls and ladies.
They are
forcing them.
Forcing themselves on girls and ladies?
Forcing them. Taking some wives from people try to do something in their lives.
Have they been killing people?
No. They don't kill civilians.
Do they bring food in with them to feed the population?
In fact, they don't. We are starving since 3 days now. I haven't taken anything.
You're hungry?
We are hungry. Very, very. Even my children, you can see them in the house now, lying down. Nothing to take.
The Biafran money, when we give them, they say no. The Biafran money is of no use.
It's unused.
area.
Do you know anything about raping or looting?
No, I know nothing about that.
What about food supplies? Is it true that the relief supplies are not coming in?
Well, we have to make a distinction between the rural areas and the towns. It is coming into the towns because it's easier to arrange for transport. But obviously, it's more difficult to penetrate into the rural area.
Have you seen any relief supplies here? Where's the feeding station?
No, this is my first visit to Oweri. I'm living about 8 or 9 miles away.
People here say that there isn't such a centre.
Well, I've just come from the police barracks, and they are distributing food every day down in the police barracks to the people.
Through the police, not the Nigerian Red Cross.
Through the police.
The war had left millions of Igbos homeless, bereaved, and unemployed. To make matters worse, Nigeria had changed its currency during the war, and so the many Easterners who still held the old Nigerian currency were left in a very precarious position. The man who was tasked by the Gowon administration to rectify the problem was the former opposition leader, Chief Obafemi Awolowo, who at the time was Nigeria's Commissioner of Finance. His solution was to simply award every Easterner a grand total of 20 Nigerian pounds, regardless of how much money he or she had in their bank account prior to the war. For obvious reasons, this policy was seen as a deliberate attempt to cripple the economic recovery of the Igbo middle and upper classes. It was also at this time that the Gowon administration passed the controversial indigenization decree, which basically forced all foreign-owned companies operating in Nigeria to sell a proportion of their shares to Nigerian citizens. With many Igbos left with just 20 Nigerian pounds to their name, the main beneficiaries of the indigenization policy were the wealthy Yoruba and Hausa Fulani elites. Even till today, the wealth of a few of Nigeria's most prominent Hausa, Fulani and Yoruba families can be traced all the way back to shares that were acquired under Gowon's indigenization policy. A whole 50 years have now passed since the end of the Civil War, but the ghost of Biafra continues to haunt the Nigerian state. Just 1 year after the death of General Ojukwu in 2011, a group known as the Indigenous People of Biafra, or IPOB for short, became the latest among several post-war Biafran secessionist movements that have tried to lead a second Biafran breakaway. The response from the Nigerian government has again been very heavy-handed, showing how little has been learned from the mistakes of the war. The IPOB leader, Nnamdi Kanu, has been arrested and harassed numerous times by the Nigerian state, which has only helped to energize his base and build his cult-like following. The Biafran question now occupies a menacing position in Nigeria's political terrain, and with each passing day, it is becoming very clear that the Nigerian government can no longer continue to sweep the matter under the carpet. The IPOB are not the only independence movement threatening to break the Nigerian Union. The oil-rich Niger Delta region, which despite being the source of Nigeria's wealth, remains one of the most underdeveloped regions in the country, has for many years been riddled with militant separatist groups such as the Niger Delta Avengers and the Niger Delta Greenland Justice Mandate. Similarly, for many years, a number of groups in the Yoruba heartlands have been calling for the creation of a separate Yoruba state that would be known as the Oduduwa Republic. The one thing that unites all of these groups is the strong belief that nothing has really changed since colonial times. In other words, the only group that still has a vested interest in the continuity of the Nigerian Union are the northern elites. And in all honesty, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand why this view is so prevalent. There is no doubt that a breakup of Nigeria would most likely lead to economic ruin for a lot of rich and powerful northerners who could potentially find themselves left behind in a landlocked country with no access to the sea, no oil revenue, and a large undereducated population, of which an estimated 50% of women have no formal education. When Frederick Lugard created Nigeria back in 1914, it was arguable that he had no idea how badly the Nigerian project would turn out. But what has become very clear over a century later is that Nigeria in its current state just does not work. For a country as large and as diverse as Nigeria, the concentration of power in the Nigerian federal government is a recipe for disaster. With large sections of its population continuing to express feelings of marginalization and disconnection from the federal government, many have been putting forward the very sensible case for a restructuring of the country in a way that devolves power from the federal government to the various regions. This would mean giving each region power over their own resources and a greater ability to decide their own destinies. But while the idea of devolving powers from the federal government may be good for Nigeria as a whole, it would obviously mean a loss of power for those who benefit under the current system. For obvious reasons, these vested interests are the biggest stumbling blocks preventing any sensible conversation about the state of the nation. For the sake of the many innocent and peace-loving Nigerians, one can only hope and pray that the Nigerian establishment chooses to loosen its tight grip on power before it's too late. Once again, it's KB Taiwo for New Africa. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, then please like and share this video. And also consider supporting us on Patreon at www.patreon.com/newafrica. Thanks again for all your support, and until next time.
Ojukwu resides in the hearts and minds of so many persons. Come to the keynote for this evening. This young brother, a graduate of the University of Nigeria, after which he worked at all the major newspapers in Nigeria, including The Guardian. And when he moved here to the United States, he pioneered publishing and expanded that once the internet made its landfall. And since then, it has been a flight that today have resulted in him being a regular on CNN, Voice of America, a columnist for some of the most prestigious newspapers in the world. He is sought after all the time on perspectives about Nigeria. And he also was a moderator of the Chinua Achebe Colloquium at Brown University before the passing of that distinguished, Nigerian. So we are delighted to have Dr. Chido Nwangu as our keynote speaker. Please, ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Dr. Chido Nwangu, publisher, a authoritative name.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Ndibo, it is my privilege to speak about a man of history, a man of consequence, a leader of manifest destiny, the man who saw tomorrow and the ghost of things to come and engaged it in a fight with very minimal resources. First of all, I want to mention what the 16th century French philosopher Michel Montaigne said about honoring a great person. He said that to honor him whom we have made is far from honoring him that made us. To honor him whom we have made is far from honoring him that made us. Michel de Montaigne. Without a doubt, some of us are alive today to talk about history, the future, and the promise of things to come, because we have great men like Ojukwu. Would you give them a round of applause? Some of us are alive today because Ojukwu had the courage to stand up and to be counted where it mattered. I have interviewed Ojukwu 4 times, and I've written at least 15 special reports and commentaries on the man. I know him just a bit. The first time I met him was in 1988 in his residence in the Nevada Lodge in Lagos. I went with the late Dr. Chuba Okadibo and Dr. Chidi Amata for a special project we were doing on Ojukwu. And then in 1994, very interesting, he came to the United States. I took him to Magic 102 FM station, which is a music station, oldies and all the hip-hop, R&B hits. I was able to persuade them to give this man 5 minutes of their prime time, the lunch drive-hour period of the station. Unfortunately for them, they agreed to give him 5 minutes. 5 minutes turned out to become 35 minutes from an African-American radio station. Ambakishe Jabiri, the late Ambakishe Jabiri is his African name. They were able to put him on. Because of Ojukwu's kinetic mind, the lucidity of his thoughts, they were able to change the format of a music station for 35 minutes, where he told them everything from African American history to the strugglings against slavery to the connectivity of the Caribbean in Jamaica, St. Martinique, Barbados, and other places where there are actual histories and physical presence of the Igbo nation and Igbo people. The phones were lit. That is speaking about the man of history. In 2000, Ojukwu and my ordinary self are godfathers to the same child. You can imagine the disparity. The ordinary me, with a former head of state, being a godfather to one child. We came to this ceremony, and they brought a plate of kola nuts. Ojukwu took all the kola nuts except one kola nut. And everybody was looking at him like, why did you have to take all the kola nuts? He said, I know what you people are thinking. You're wondering, why did I take all the kola nuts? And left only one for me. He shook his head and said one word. Now we'll DK. The one we came back is DK, is warrior. In fact, he's a man of history, and he lived as a warrior. In terms of my reading of him as a man of manifest destiny, you can imagine how Ojukwu has throughout his life been at critical junctures of the history of Nigeria. But the most important thing is that he had the courage to stand up and to be counted. When Ojukwu died, we had a special edition of Class magazine, US Africa Class magazine. and there were pictures of starving Biafran kids in the magazine. My son, Chidonwan II, saw the magazine and asked, "Daddy, why are these kids looking like this? And why are you always talking about Ojukwu, Ojukwu, Ojukwu?" I went to YouTube and showed him even more challenging stories, which is why it is good to see a lot of young Igbo kids here. As it is said, if you do not know when the rain started pelting on you, you will not know when the rain will stop. If we forget history, it repeats itself. Ojukwu saw history. One of the major visionary realities and experiences of Ojukwu is the fact that he saw radical fundamentalism before most persons in Nigeria saw it. He had the courage to stand up to fight it. Before Rwanda, like I wrote in an essay on Ojukwu, Ojukwu fought against genocidal slaughter of an ethnic persons. Ojukwu was not all about politics. Ojukwu was a traditionalist. Ojukwu understood the contours, the dynamics, the elements, the fine-tuning of the essence of the Nnewi traditions, of the Igbo culture, of the trajectory of the Igbo nation, where we're going as a people, where we've been as a people, and what we should teach our younger generation. Even at that, Ojukwu lived life on his own terms. Ojukwu did not live life with any apologies to no one. Ojukwu is the consummate guy who understood the fact that he had to be on earth once, but that, like I love the phrase that I use, a life of consequence. There are leaders who live lives that are regardless. They live a life without the footprints of greatness. There is nothing to remember about them. They are like candles in the wind. They got blown away by circumstance, by the wind and rain of time, by the tide of everyday experience. But Ojukwu resides in the hearts and minds of so many persons. And I see some of our brothers from across the Niger, Igbozo, which some are called Igbozo, Anyocha and Yoma. In 1995, I registered as an honorary member of the Anyoma and Anyocha meeting. I'm an Aruna, Ojari and Akwata Urumba. But I did that to send a message of the interconnectedness of who we are. There are those of our brothers, especially in the River State area, in the Ikwere area specifically, who out of the combustion of the post-Civil War Nigeria solemnly say that somebody whose name is Chiemeka, or whose name is Chukwuma, or whose name is Chidozie, is not Igbo, but is a new nationality that is far on our part and only shares neighborliness and transactional interest with the Igbo, just because we lost the war. But we speak of a leader who lived without any apologies. A leader who will not deny you, come hell or high water, come rain, thunder, whatever it might be. I was at the launch of his book because I'm involved at the NIAA. I was taken by my mentor, Dr. Chuba Kadibu. There were 3 of us in the car, the driver, 4 of us, the driver one, myself seated at the front. Chuba and Ojukwu seated at the back. The man said that today the rest of Nigeria will hear everything important that he's been planning to say, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. And because I'm involved, turned out to be one of the highest selling books written by any Nigerian leader. I am separating my summary presentation in thematic capsules and anecdotes. That way we can see Ojukwu as a regular human being. It is important to know that Ojukwu was not without his many contradictions. He wasn't perfect. Without a doubt, he was not perfect. As a political scientist, I have read Ojukwu's various positions on Nigeria. One is consistent, the other one is also consistent. The first is that he is a federalist who believes in the oneness of Nigeria, in the collaborative union of the federative aspects and units of Nigeria. Then the contradiction arose when, due to war, due to the killings of his people, he had to become an ethnic nationalist. But Ojukwu said in an interview that I had with him that I loved Nigeria so much that Nigeria kept pushing him away. And the other thing he said that we had a choice, quote, to resist and survive or become slaves in our own country, which is the rationale for Biafra. A contradiction of Ojukwu could also be found when he returned to Nigeria. The very progressive Ojukwu, who belonged or who should belong more to a political party of the whole persuasion of progressivism, had to pitch his tent with the new feudal structure movement known as the NPA. The contradiction also emerged when Ojukwu, as an icon of the resolute Igbo identity to survive against all odds, did not join the NPP. In an interview, I heard him specifically say that his joining the NPP would have meant, quote, the gathering of the clans, of the Igbo clan. Those were his exact words. The contradiction then came up later when it became necessary in terms of the geopolitics of the country. He had to found the AGA political movement as a way of returning again from federalist interest rather than join the PDP and the other emanations that are federalist. He had to come back to create, if you will, an Igbo interest political organization. The other challenge with our great leader, Ojukwu, regarding the Biafra War, the discretions and the decisions that were made in the war. There are those who felt that he could have made more deals, given more concessions in oil, done more flexibility in order to extend the interest of Biafra. There are those who insist that without Ojukwu standing up and leading the fight up until he did, that more Igbos would have been killed in Nigeria, and others said that more Igbos were killed in fact because the struggle took a longer time. On balance, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I will plead to the fact that I am someone who admires Ojukwu very strongly. I have written in laudatory terms of a man that embodies the muscularity, the boldness, the greatness that is possible in Africa and among African leaders. I speak about a man whose dedication to his people made him say, in part I'll quote, that he chose priestly poverty over the wealth and privileges that he was born into in order to serve his people. If we need to look back a little into the 1920s and the 30s, Ojukwu's father, Sir Louis Ojukwu himself, financed with Green Mbadiwe, K. Mbadiwe's older relation, the politics and the agitations of Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe and of the NCNC. But at the time, it was a society where there was the division of labor. It is not a situation whereby if suddenly you landed on money, then you suddenly think that you have to become the leader of the community all at the same time. We had a society where we knew every person's capacity and specialization. And why that is very important is that Ojukwu, leading Biafra and Biafrans and other persons of southeastern Nigeria, was able to mobilize and catalyze the intellectual capacities of the region, where Unibri and other creative things, where coconut oil and things like that were used to move aircrafts and to move engines. And to that, and for many other reasons, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, would you please help me in giving a standing ovation to the great man who passed that will prevent. Please a round of applause.
Ọhaneze ndị ọma dị ige anyị ntị, ụmụ Biafra ndị ọma, anyị dị nabata mmadụ niile n'oge ihe omume anyị mbụ nzukọ ndị ngwa. Ndị dị igwetara unu nzukọ ndị ngwa mbụ ndị ngwa nọ na IPOB, Indigenous People of ndị ngwa IPON in short form. Ọ bụ ebe anyị ihe dị egwetara unu ihe omume ka a dịkpọ nzukọ ndị ngwa na redio Biafra. Ọkwa na anyị na Maazị Alụzi nọ na redio Biafra US. Mara asụ ụmụ Biafra ndị ọma dị ike adị udo dịkwara unu. Dịka anyị dị nabata mmadụ niile, mara nwanne m nwoke onye gbara ekwudo emeta ihe na-ada aga aga nọkwa nwanna kelee ọhaneze.
Ndị ka anyị ndewo nụ. Oge akara aka eruola anyị ndị kpọbata mmadụ niile ndị ọbụla n'ebe ọbụla nọ hụ mana mgbe anyị njiga ibe ilekọta onwe anyị anya ịlụ ụzọ anyị njiga ime ala Biafra dị mma. Maazị Evangelist n'aka gị o, aka mara gị nji ya. Ndewo.
Nwanne ịgbalịgbara ahụ nwanne m nwoke, anyị gbadụ ọdụ ụzọ gbaa ya akụla oge abụghị enyi anyị, anyị nga ịgbafe ọsọ na-atụ egwu ha ọjọọ ọbụla esita onye nna ya jere oyi ji eji ụkwụ agbakọ ibu. Dịka anyị ga-anabata gị n'oge nzukọ ndị ngwa, kpọbata ndị enyi ndekọ ọdọ, kpọọ ikwu na ibe gị. Ọ bụ ndị gara ole abụ nọrọ akụkụ azụmahịa, abụ ndị gara ole abụ nọrọ akụkụ ụlọ ọrụ, ọ bụ ndị enyi gara obila akụkụ ụlọ nke ndị bekee kpọrọ ndị nnebọ, ndị agbata obi gị si obi ya na anyị efukwala oche anyị bịara ụbọchị taa. Ọ bụ ha ndị eji eme ha anyị gwefere onwe anyị, na ọ bụ ha anyị gasị ide eme mgbe ọbụla iji hụdatara ozi ọma Chineke ga-egala mba niile, dịka akwụkwọ nsọ ji kwuo sị na ozi ọma Chineke ga-egala mba niile tupu nwa ya abịa. Ana ya asịla he obi ụtọ mbụla nke na gboo ga-ebịala ọgbụgbọ oge owuwe ihe ubi. Ọ bụ na o duru ndị ngwa anyị wasị na nkwụ achaala na nkwụ ga-amara gị ịcha acha ya achaala oge aba ya eme onye ọbụla gị ihe nkwụ gị ihe mee ihe ma marala ọ bụ nkwụ ọbụla ihe na mkpụrụ esi achala oge aba bụ nwoke ọbụla igbutara ya si igbute nwa ike nkwụ iri inwere olileanya ọ ga-ejiri otu galọn gị gbuo rọba inwere otu rọba nwekwa kele yara ara mara ọ bụ ire otu rọba gwere ekpo mkpa gị gwere kọrọdọ ndị ejiri akwa ọlị gị dara ara dabịanya ya eji nha ete mmiri. Anyị dị nabata mmadụ niile n'oge nzukọ ndị ngwa oge ụbọchị taa mbụ abalị abụọ n'ime ọnwa isii, taa mbụ abalị abụọ n'ime ọnwa isii n'afọ mbụ 2021. A na-abịala ọdọ. Anyị dị nabata mmadụ niile ebe ọbụla ị nọla mba ofesi, ị nọla ala Igbo, ị nọla ala Naijiria, ebe ọbụla ị nọ na the whole Biafra land, ebe ọbụla ị nọ dị ege anyị ntị. Anyị dị nabata mmadụ niile. Ọ bụ ihe mwute dịka ozi m dị ịnata na ụmụnna anyị ndị nọ na Aba si na FM redio were ọ dịghị ikwu ekwu. So ọ bụ ihe mwute, ọ bụkwanụ ndị kwesịrị ige ntị na ihe na anyị ndị ime obe na Abuja, obe na ogwe m onye nọ ogwe m onye adị otu m jide ege. So ama m otu ụmụnna anyị ndị nọ n'ụlọ ji redio wee adịghị ikwu okwu. Anụ ihe m dị enugbo mbụ kemgbe abalị ole na ole gara aga, even ehi anyị mere ọnọdụ ihe omume nọ n'ụlọ redio adịfu ekwu. So ọ bụla bụ ndị ihe gbasara ihe igwe redio ndị aka unu ndị n'olu ndị ngwa unu biko na FM relay station nọ na-aba ndị anyị mkpa ka ụmụnna anyị ndị nọ n'ụlọ nwee ike dị ege ama mma otu ọ dịla steeti ndị gọdọ bikos he na anyị ndị ime ọ bụghị naanị ndị ka anyị ndị ike ọ dịga mba niile, ọ dịga ụwa niile. Biko anyị agaghịla ka ebe ọ bụla anyị ga-ede enwe ihe aramahụ na ihe gbasara igwe redio. Anụ redio ya bụ ndụ ụfọdụ ndị ka anyị dị. Ụfọdụ nwe na otu ama adịghị ike obi adịghị tọwa ụtọ, nwe na otu ama adịghị ike ya dị ka ọ bụ ọrịa dị iche bịara we betụwejisie ike ha tụtụtụdu anya asọ high BP ala echiche ala bikos ọ bụ ebe a mba ebe adịwe nata ozi ọma, ọ bụ ebe a ebe adịwe hụ ka ihe dị ime ebe a ebe bụgwede ego ya otu na de ego olu onye isi anyị mbụ Maazị Nnamdi Kanu obi ara atọwa ụtọ biko adịghị ikpere m labụ nọ n'ala ebe ọ bụla nnọdụ a n'olu anyị daa n'olu ndị ngwa biko unu lebara ahụ gbasara redio aba anya na ọ dị mkpa ama m ebe ke ndị ka ọdọbata ke ndị aba dị mkpa ahụ maka ụmụnna anyị ndị nọ n'ụlọ dịka anyị na-anabata mmadụ niile anyị jikwa ebe a dị ekele nwanne anyị nwoke onye anyị na-elabụ nọ nga mbụ Maazị Alozie si ya udo dịrị ya dịkwa ekele onye shiwara na ya ada abụọ mbụ papa ukwu onye bụ ya nọwụ taa ya mara otu ụbọchị ndị ka ọdọ bịata nji arịte onye bụ eluigwe zie ya ozi ya eziokwu anyị bụ ndị bụ mmadụ ọ bụ ndị nwụrụ anwụ anyị dị ikele ebe ọ bụla ị nọ Maazị Nnamdi Kanu ndị ngwa dị ikele gị la oge ha omume anyị bụ nzukọ ndị ngwa la redio Biafra US anyị na-esi papa ka iji jidesie ya ike ha kpọrọ ha mgbekwara ha anya ndị ọjọọ eletala gị ọ bụla ezigbo aga kwesịrị ịsa agbalịkalịka akwụkwọ nsọ kwuru ya ekwu ọkwa gwawe gbachalịkalịka ike agụwe mana ha ndị ikpe ekpere ya dịkpechi ike bụ ka onye nwaanyị eze Chukwu okike ya bịa ma nyekwasị gị ike ike nyekwasị gị ike ike tire mmụọ oke dị ike tie igwerede anyị bibi ndị iro anyị niile ma mgbe ikpeazụ Biafra ga-ebịa obodo a dịka ọ bụ obodo Chineke kwere anyị na mkpa abụrụ ha anyị ga-eji nyefee n'aka Chineke obi ụtọ mbụla ịdị na-atadịrị nkwụ ka bịa ọnụ na mgbufu ya eduwara mmadụ asị onye isi anyị bụ Maazị Nnamdi Kanu, the leader of indigenous people of Biafra and director of Radio Biafra. Papa ukwu ikpere bụ ike mbụ ndị Biafra ụmụnne gị ụmụ ndị ngwa nọla IPOB papa anyị ndị esighị Maazị na-awụ ka nka anyị si udo dịrị gị ha ịkpọrọ ihe mgbekwara ha anyị dị nabata onye isi anyị bụ Maazị Nnamdi Kanu na-ekele ya dịka anyị na-ega n'ihu ikele onye isi were na ya ada abụọ dịka anyị dịkwa nabata mmadụ niile tasị ebe ọ bụla nọ ịbụ nwoke ịbụ onye ngwa ndị oke mmadụ Maazị na-awụnụ ka anọ nka olu n'otu ole dị otu ụbọchị taa anụ eji m aka na ihe omume anyị mere n'ụbọchị ndị ole gara aga mbụla ọgwụgwọ ọnwa gara aga rụọ gara ka ọma dịka ozi ndewa anyị natara ebe anyị nọkwa onye ọbụla kọtara saịlị dịka ozi ndewa anyị natara la mba niile dị iche iche obodo ka mpụkwa n'obodo ka a mụrụ anyị mbụkwa n'ala ngwa ndị na-ekwetafu ehi a kwetere bikọs eji ya bụ oke mmadụ liala anwụ ị gakwana igwe onye tara ose ṅụọ mmiri ahụrụ m datala ndị na-ekwetafu ekwetala otu nwoke si ma ị na-ahụ ụzọ ma ị na-afụ ụzọ wee naanị ihe so onye na-adịghị hụ ụzọ ga-adị ịnụ anụ dị oge ndị nawa niile anyị dị ikele ndị nwoke anyị niile ndị niile tiri aka hụ datala emetara ihe ịnọ n'ụlọ ahụ iji kire ndị nwụrụ anwụ ugwu ọ bụla anyị si weziri ikelido adị wezigwara ikelido kpu ọ dịkwa mkpa anyị nke ime ga-ebịa bikos anyị dịkwa ego so olu wakwa ọgụ bikos ogwu ndị dị elu ka ime mmụọ ogwu anyị gbanarịkwa alụ ka a na-arụ oti ogwu anyị wee nji ọnụ daalụ ọ bụ ọgụ ala ada elu ekere ọnụ eke ndị nwụrụ n'iche ga ịda alụ kewe ndị dị ndụ agatakwa otu ụzọ ma ọ bụ nke ọzọ dekwa alụ kewe ndị eji m aka na ihe omume ahụ anyị mere ọ bụ ha niile ji emela afọ alaghị ala gara ka ọma n'obodo niile dị iche iche gbaa gburugburu Biafra ma Enugu ebe ọbụla ọ kpọtụrụ akpọtụ mana ala obeke na mbụkwa obeke anyị obe na mbụla ala ngwa ọ kpọtụrụ ebe ogbe anyị nọkwa mba Abuja ọ gakwara ka ọma ebe ogbe anyị mekwara ka anyị otu anyị ejikwa eme ya ahụkwara m ihe onyonyo ụmụnne anyị ndị nọ mba ofesi m mekwara ọ bụ otu ala ọ bụ otu onye chọrọ ya ada akọ ya kwuo okwu onye ọbụla ege ntị ọ bụghị ndị fojuo akpa anyị dị ikele mmadụ niile nwanne adịghị nwere egwu ọhaneze maka ihe omume anyị mere n'okporo ụbọchị ole na ole gara aga mbụ ịkwanyere ndị nwụrụ anwụ n'oge agwụ dịka anyị dị ikwu okwu anyị sị nwanne dịghị nwere ịgwa ụmụnne anyị ndị nrụdatala ihe omume anyị mere n'ụbọchị ole na ole gara aga gara kọma mbụ our Fallen Heroes Day anyị mere dịghị nwere ego ọhaneze ị ga-ekele otu esi na-eme ka afọ ole were aka ka nwanne m nwoke
ndị ka anyị ndewonu eziokwu a sịla eji ya agwa onye ntị na ọsọ esula obi ndị m ụtọ gafee n'omume anyị mere hie ụzọ mkpụrụkpụkpụ ndị mmadụ aghọtawala ha dị ka site n'ike Chineke onye ndu anyị bụ Maazị Nnamdi Kanu anaghị ekwu okwu a the mad element, okay, woman, I preach near day, when Mr. preaching, they may preach, and you to her when you get them, for that deep with a but to move in the motor with a walano. La Obodende Kemhona Hola, Ihofufe, Ndeka Obodo Ebonyi State, Lobodo Abia State, Lobodo Imo State, Ozon Kurubu, Emetre Koma, Kegala Wanambude, Mada Sejuni Chinekani, Mbundi Donyen, ta Odu say Kenny Ike, ta Memai David Lembido, to the wiki, to half a buhembo, Emekate, Adeki Kindi Kengurabo, Masi Uniwan Buchinekani, Sidili Koji Bruchi. Logi Mahila de Chamma. One de Moko, Utaha, Asem Lutan Demma, had a Megruta Hagawa, and they won.
Abola Bo Bia Levatara Bo, Boya Radio, Udan, Ude Kono, Gidas, and the Abundole. Yabola Tabo, Gambeno Luane, Gida Niguka, Gidas, Tinekili, Lakabo, Lubuka, Bola Radio Biafra, Inde Abundole, Abundem Guanola IPOB. Kena Bobo Chani with Tarani Gideji, Emeto Hales and Marahan and Deka. Lozoma Chineka Biolanda. Obu oge nzukọ ndị ngwala nọ n'ime dịka ihe omume anyị dịga ụmụnna anyị ndị chọrọ iti ihe ọnụ la ha anyị dịka ndị nwere otu ihe ma ọ bụ kọọdụ nwere we ikwula ha anyị ndị ime dịkwa akara ekwentị gị ji kpọtụrụ anyị 081 30 54 19 35. Only number of Sigitiya +234. That is the code number of Ndezu. Tambara order 081 30 54 19 35. Ya brole bonwa form gwanno na IPOB. Idi n'olu a na-echọkwara otigi ji doro ụmụnna la ha dị ime. Lọdị mmadụ kpakpata mkpata ọgụ ya adịwela anya. ịchọrọ ịdụ ụmụnna ndị ngwa nọ na IPOB na ha anyị ndị ime dịkwa akara ekwentị ị ga-ekpọ nke na-abụ onye ọbụla nchọrọ mbụ nwa afọ ngwa nọ na IPOB nọ mba ofesi ọ bụghị ndị nọ n'ụlọ ndị mmadụ eji anụ ihe nke na-abụ onye ọbụla mbụ nwa afọ ngwa nnọ mba ofesi nna asai kọntrị nna abroad ịchọrọ ịdụ anya na ha anyị ndị ime ịchọrọ ịmatakwu ha anyị ndị ime dịkwa akara ekwentị ị ga-ekpọ +1202 560 1655 ka mkpọgharịa ya ọdọ ịchọrọ ịbụ nwa afọ ngwa nọ na IPOB ịchọrọ ịdọwa ụmụnna gị dịkwa akara ekwentị ị ga-ekpọ mata ha anyị ndị ime dụwa anyị na ha anyị ndị ime ma na ọgbakọ anyị ndị ime mbụ +1202 560 1655 ọ bụrụ na ịchọghị ịdụ anya akpọrọla anwala anwa ịkpọ n'ime ahụla ọ bụ foreign number gị ga-akpọwa anwala anwa ịkpọ ga-abụ fọ ndị chọrọ ịdụwa anyị na ha anyị ndị ime dịka oge dị ugbu a anaghị agbakpe ụlọ ekwentị anyị maka onye chọrọ ikwu ha ọ ga-ekwu anyị chọrọ ikwutu mkpụrụ okwu olulu bifo a na-agbafu ya ọsọ ọ bụ ihe mwute na oge dị ugbu oge ndị na ugbu oge ndị anyị nọ n'ime ya anyị nọ n'oge ihe isi ike oge ihe iru uju anyị nọ ịgba mfụ ọhịa mfụ ụzọ site he otu ụmụnna anyị nji aka wede metụrụ wele ọ bụghị anyị ụfọdụ ụmụnna anyị amụtala ịgagharịrị atụgharị aka ebe ụmụnna anyị nọ agala ụlọ dakpọrọ ndị iro anyị wara agala ụlọ dakpọrọ ụmụnna anyị daga eduwa ụlọ nga ama m uche obi ama m ha ivulu obi dị akpọ dị agwa ndị n'otu ahụ ama m ha nwere ike ime onye ugwu maọbụ onye ofe manụ ya kpọrọ onye Igbo nọ n'ọrụ nchekwa maọbụ onye ukwu ekere ga-atọrọ aka nga nwanne ya nwoke nọsi ya ma o vuru ya ama m ego ole nwere ike inye onye ugwu onye Fulani maọbụ onye ofe mmanụ ya tụrụ aka nga nwanne ya nọ ama m ego ole nwere ike inye onye dota ọtụtụ ihe o ji kara njọrọ ụmụnna anyị emere ya unu eme kemgbe eziokwu mbụ na ha si ya na otu ara kwara ya bụrụ ịbụ nwa afọ Biafra nwa afọ ngwa nwa afọ Igbo adị m ikwu karịsịala ndị ngwa bikọs adị m ka ndị ama ebutate ngwa ndị abụ m ga-ekwu ha ma akọwe ngwa ngwa ya bụrụ ịbụ nwa afọ ngwa ịnọla agwado otu a ọ bụla iri ala erie chọọkwa ụzọ gba ọ ka iriri eri nga na-aga ịba anyị n'ala abụ bikọs ọ bụghị ịkpacha agwa ewere ile gị cherela nga na ga ịba anyị n'ala abụ ọ gaghị ịbata anyị n'ala abụ nwanne m nwoke ịhụrụ otu ha ọ bụ jide ada mfọta ma eji ahụ otu ụmụnne anyị ji dakpa agwa adịghị mma dakpa agwa ka ndị refuru dakpa agwa ka ndị